This is another Poets at War General Report. And here's your General, Joshua David Ling.
Good luck.
What's up, everybody? Good to see you again. I'm here, and I'm being dragged into a conversation that I really didn't want to get dragged into. But before we get into that, this is the General's Report. This is the section of the Poets at War podcast where I talk to you all directly, without any guest, without any other connection, but I can just speak on a topic. Lately, these have actually been pretty popular. I've been telling some cool stories. You can check them out of my life. Most recently, my father and his story of getting shot back in 1987, and that spurring him on to marry my mother. So that's a interesting family story. We try to encourage people to be their family's bard, to not turn to the right or to the left, and the Lord will be with them wherever they go. We know all this stuff, but. Yeah, okay, so we have a problem with not just illiteracy in Christian culture, but that's a big problem. Biblical illiteracy of just generally the great grand scheme of literature, unfortunately. And I've been running into a particular one that I wanted to get into, and it is tangential to a big discussion of Halle Bailey, as the Little Mermaid. This is why I didn't want to get into this topic, because quite frankly, all sides are wrong and messed up. The vast majority of sides, let's put it that way, are wrong on this topic. But as a result, we have also thrown under the bus a very interesting character from literature and history in the writer of the original fairy tale of The Little Mermaid, Hans Christian Andersen. And as a result, I'm also going to be bringing up a few people, George MacDonald, J.M. Barrie, and Lewis Carroll. Similar time period, similar culture that each of them came from, and similar things that they were all accused of at various points. Maybe George MacDonald not as much because he was a pastor, but anyway, let's go ahead and get into this. So before I get into the actual discussion of Hans, which is the main thing I want to get into, I'm going to play a TikTok for you from a user. I'll put the name in somewhere. And he pretty much identifies the exact position that I hold on the whole Halle Bailey as the Little Mermaid sort of thing. And yeah, we'll go ahead and play that now.
That's why I want Black Clark Kent. For all the little black boys to see Clark Kent.
Okay, this isn't a conversation I thought I'd be joining, but you seem well-intentioned, so I'm going to explain why you're going to be hard-pressed to find a black person who wants a black Clark Kent. Now, I'm a little softer on the whole race swap thing than a lot of black nerds are, mostly because being too hard on it would make me a hypocrite. Spider-Man is my favorite superhero. Peter Parker is my Spider-Man, but I also really like Miles Morales. I grew up on the Bruce Timm Justice League shows, so John Stewart is my Green Lantern. Green Lantern is black in my mind. But you know what John Stewart and Miles Morales have in common? They are unique characters adopting the mantle of the superhero. You see, what I don't like is what I call palette swap representation. For those who don't know, a palette swap is what they would do on old video games to save time and money. They would take a character, they would change the color of the character and call it a different character. Luigi used to be a palette swap of Mario. Scorpion and Sub-Zero are palette swaps. When you're making a video game and have limited resources, that makes sense. When you're making a Hollywood movie and have millions of dollars, it's just lazy. There are black Superman characters, really interesting ones, and it would be nice to see them in a movie. And it can be done in a way that makes money. Find me somebody who didn't like Spider-Verse. Personally, I would prefer to see original black characters on screen. It's criminal that we haven't gotten a Static Shock movie yet. But if you must do Black Superman, use one of the ones we already have. Nobody wants a black Clark Kent.
Okay, so we heard that discussion. We heard what he had to say. I don't have much to add to that. Palette swap is a major problem because it is lazy writing. It is also not giving the justification of not justification. It's not giving joy and what's the term? It's not giving honor. Let's put it that way to the other races that it seeks to represent. It's tokenification, through this whole situation. So if you want to, talk to me about that, if you want to go further on that, that's fine. But I would have no problem with someone like Idris Elba playing Gandalf, for instance, right? Or Saruman. I think he'd do a great job. But he would get past any and all anachronisms or things of that nature that kind of take me out of the story to begin with. So, I'm not one who sits there and yells about, culture being destroyed, white culture being destroyed, black culture being destroyed. People think way too hard on this. The fact is, what's the best way we can tell the story and why? Right? And everyone has their worldview as to why that would be the case. But let's talk from a craft angle, please. Can we talk from a craft angle what the best choice of casting would be? I haven't seen Halle Bailey's performance. I'm not interested in seeing Halle Bailey's performance because of the, quite frankly, dismal script writing and directing that I've seen from Disney in the past several years. And so that's just not on my list of things to be that interested in. However, I am extremely interested in The Little Mermaid. I actually rewrote The Little Mermaid in rhyme in a different, my own version of the story. And in doing that, did a lot of delving and research, not only into The Little Mermaid itself, but into the man who wrote it, Hans Christian Andersen, and what he was trying to accomplish through that story. Unfortunately, a lot of websites have been spreading false rumors and things about him, and one that I've been consistently hearing, yet I have yet to trace back to its original source, is the idea that it was he was a homosexual, and it was a love letter written to another guy. The Little Mermaid was somehow a love letter written to another guy. I really want to know where that idea started, because it is patently, demonstrably false. From his own admission, he was a Christian man. Hans Christian Andersen was a self-proclaimed Christian. He was a no-heller, which puts him outside of orthodoxy a little bit. But doesn't necessarily make him heretical exactly. He also was a universalist, but he was a Trinitarian universalist, not Unitarian. He was a very interesting, weird dude who was very obviously dyslexic and autistic from all accounts. He was an awkward individual. He's very long and lanky, and as a result, he found a lot of friendship in young people and children and that sort of a thing. And a lot of people, of course, went, especially now in modern days, this really started to happen at the beginning of the 20th century, when we started to have an increase in pedophilia and other things, and it was becoming more in the spotlight. People were like, I wonder if that guy was. And a lot of the people who seek to destroy a lot of these, bastions of fairy tales and stuff, seek to discredit them, unfortunately get into all kinds of errors and things. And, not everyone, and that's what we're going to get to with Lewis Carroll, was, demonstrably in the clear. One of them, as far as I can tell through my intense research into Hans Christian Andersen, he was above board with that. I wrote a few things down in some comment threads I wanted to read to you. One of the biggest things that I wanted to mention was a passage from Hans Christian Andersen's autobiography to give you an idea of who this man was. This is sort of a piece of his testimony from his autobiography. He was sent away from his home by his parents because they could no longer afford him. That's how bad their situation was. They could no longer afford him. He was a young man. He was like 16, something like that, maybe even younger. And he had to go to Copenhagen to seek his fortune. And this is him telling his own story. I stood there deeply wounded. I knew no one in all Copenhagen who could give me either counsel or consolation. I thought of death as being the only thing, the best thing for me. But even then my thoughts rose upwards to God. And with all the undoubting confidence of a child in his father, they riveted themselves upon him. I wept bitterly. And then I said to myself, when everything happens really miserably, then he sends help. I have always read so. People must first of all suffer a great deal before they can bring anything to accomplishment. So with that in mind, we can dive in a little bit further into him. There's some interesting theories about the fact that he may have been bastarded royalty. The way he was taken care of by the court in Denmark when he was found and, discovered, so to speak, as this great writer of children's tales. He was a failed opera singer because he blew out his voice, and he just down on his luck. And weirdly enough, though, the court kind of took him in, got him a patron, and they took care of him. And he was a bachelor who wrote children's stories. Like I said, he was likely very autistic and very dyslexic. He had a real hard time writing any sort of novel or anything like that. He could really only keep it to shorter children's stories, possibly ADHD as well. He had a rough life that culminated in a fairy tale ending in many cases. He did have some women that he was sweet on at various points. It's pretty clear, but that never solidified into anything. And I think the main reason is because, like I said, he was so awkward. I don't think you can find anything going anywhere near, time and day of who he was. People saying anything odd about him and his, relationship to children. He wasn't like alone with tons of children, it's a kind of weird situation. But, then we get to some other people of the time, and I'm going to get into this sort of pattern we start to see in the 1800s and early 1900s. Let's go to Lewis Carroll. He's kind of on another end of the spectrum. He self-admittedly had a crush on his relation. I forget if it was a cousin or a niece or something. You can look that up, but it's pretty well documented that he had a crush on her. And even though his wife, and I tend to believe her, vehemently says that nothing ever happened, it's pretty clear in his writings that he had extreme mental temptation and trauma throughout this situation. I do find it somewhat tragic, but at the same time, like, he's not he's not in any way, excused by his thoughts and actions and things that he wrote. He wrote Alice in Wonderland, for those who are wondering. I think he was somewhat driven insane by sort of mathematical, logic and stuff like that. And he started to become very interested in contrarian thinking. And that's why he wrote Alice in Wonderland. Now, I like Alice in Wonderland. I think it's especially Through the Looking Glass, I think is a good story. And it actually has an interesting concept of a moral where essentially the idea is, we need to take time to think about nonsense, because think of things that are seemingly trivial because they might not be. So with that said, yeah, he was one that a lot of people, even in his day, thought was a little strange. And I think he kind of colored things wrong for a lot of people further on down the line. Another person in this similar category is George MacDonald, but he's similar more because he was raised in Scotland. He's written a lot of stories. You'll recognize them if you check it out. I'm blanking on a bunch of them. But he's written a lot of stories, and C.S. Lewis was a big fan of his. He was a pastor. He wrote a lot of sermons too. But he came out of kind of what I'm trying to get to, which caused a lot of this interest in children and children's stories kind of recurring into society. It was a counterculture to the blind indifference of the Industrial Revolution. And unfortunately, one of the ways the cold, blind indifference of the Industrial Revolution worked its way into the church was through a doctrine that, and set of doctrines that I wholeheartedly believe. And those are Calvinist doctrines. For those who don't know, look up the doctrines of grace. You'll find them, you'll look at them, and if you'll either have the reaction, oh, that's totally what I believe and that's biblical, or, oh, that's a little weird, I don't know that I would put it that way. Ultimately, the expressions of Calvinism during that time were being infected by humanist, secular, cold, blind indifference. And unfortunately, it caused many Christians, so-called, to not act like or be Christians whatsoever. And one of the biggest countercultures, one of the strongest countercultures against it was sort of, it was a combination of romantic thinking and Kantian thinking. If you look up Kant, the philosopher, Kant, he believed in this idea of the noble savage. And you can see, George MacDonald being raised Calvinist, and he rebelled against it. Hans, we don't see that exactly, but we see kind of the culture, the blind indifference, right? We see that with J.M. Barrie, who I'm about to get to in a minute. He was raised Calvinist and rebelled against it. And this is something that consistently happens over and over and over during this period. They rebel against this because they know that there's something beautiful, because they can see it with their eyes, they can taste it with their tongue, they can hear it with their ears. And it's being pushed against in thinking and philosophy and whatever else, especially by the church at the time, and it caused all kinds of problems. The idea of the noble savage in Kantian think is basically like Pocahontas, right? The idea that if you just leave them alone, if you just leave people alone and they, live in the woods all by themselves, and they just live out whatever, feelings that they have, that somehow they're going to turn out right and good. We see this in Peter Pan, J.M. Barrie, right? We see this glorification of instinct, this glorification of the untempered man. And unfortunately, J.M. Barrie was a guy, he was accused of stuff a lot more later, but by the admission of many of the kids that he hung out with and the parents and everything else, he was a man who had a horrible family life from the moment he was born into one of these ridiculously hyper-Calvinist families, up until his wife divorced him because she was having an affair with another man. And his whole world was just a sad, lonely place, quite frankly, that he was trying to mend by becoming friends and family with different families that had children. He was looking for a place to exist and be loved and to love. And unfortunately, this is a pattern that we see over and over and over and over again during this whole period. And we still see some of the implications of that in places like Nashville, which I'll get to another time. The way Nashville and the South have had this sort of, the evangelical South, the Bible Belt, have had this problem, this back and forth love-hate fest for a long time. And so, getting back to Hans specifically, don't be so quick to throw our fairy tale writers under the bus. Because the bad guys, yeah, I'm calling them bad guys, want to claim them as one of their own. Don't give in. Read what they say from their own mouth. Read what the people who knew them said about them. And then when you start to get to all these academics who are like, I wonder if he was gay. Stop. Think. Read. when we start arguing, and I've seen people argue this on Facebook, well, why are we just upset about this story in the first place? It's a problematic story because, bestiality because it's a fish, and all these other sorts of things. It's a fairy tale, and it was written for a reason. And if you don't know what that reason is, please don't be ignorant about it. Okay? Please read, learn. You might just find out something incredible that you didn't realize, right? Fairy tales were written by people who had large philosophical things to say and to teach to everybody, not just children. Now, Hans was a little bit more toward children because fairy tales had been sort of relegated during his time to children, and those are who liked it and who liked him. But that's a story for another time. Fairy tales are not just for children. And I'm going to definitely get into some C.S. Lewis on that and some other folks who have talked about the relegation of fairy tales to the nursery. But yeah, I said there were going to be fireworks. I hope there were fireworks. And share this. Like, comment, share. And we're going to talk more about this later, along with other things. The next episode of General's Report will be on Monday, Lord willing. That will be Snow White. We're going to be talking about Snow White and what she means, both in the original fairy tale versions and the Disney version, and what we can learn from that. So join the storytelling, because I'm not some, unorthodox crazy person here, even though my clothing might say so. I am actually trying to show you where the lines are, because so many people have forgotten. So many people have forgotten where these battle lines are. So join me in the trenches next time on Poets at War. Be your family's bard. Do not turn to the right or to the left, and the Lord will be with you wherever you go. We'll see you next time.
God of song said